Good evening and welcome to another developer chat here on Game Wisdom for our Perceptive podcast series. We're going to be talking a little bit more high-level discussion for our chat tonight, as we're going to be discussing kind of the challenges when it comes to turning a studio or turning a game into a popular IP. As we've been talking a lot more about sustainability in the game dev space, these kinds of conversations are going to become more and more important, especially when it comes to long-term support and livelihood. My guest tonight, he is the CEO of Leverage, a company that has been specializing in helping studios and developers when it comes to kind of developing their games as a potential IP. So please welcome to the podcast, Christian. How are you doing?
Hey, I'm doing great. It's a sunny morning here in Copenhagen, so yeah, things are good. We're waiting for the autumn.
Yeah. It is the dead of night here on the East Coast, and we're waiting for torrential rain coming any second now, so very different environments here.
We get 6, 7 months of winter where it rains horizontally and snows, so yeah, I know how you feel.
Yeah. It is a pleasure to have you on for this conversation, and thank you again for expressing interest in coming on to talk about Leverage and about what you do.
Well, I have to say, the idea of your whole podcast is brilliant. I love diving deep into games, so let's do it.
All right. And before we get going, for those of you watching this right now, if you are interested in coming on to talk about game dev, a game you're working on, or any other topic, be sure to reach out. So, since this is your first time on the podcast, Christian, could you talk a little bit more about who you are and what is your background when it comes to game dev?
Sure. So we're, I would say, a boutique consultancy that helps studios and publishers to build lasting franchises, so lasting IPs. And I spent my youth playing Dungeons and Dragons and having a lot of home computers, and then I got into movies. But coming out of my education, I realized that there wasn't really any storytelling on the internet, and not very much on games either when I was coming out. So I basically just started making game stories on the net. I think I did 30 of those and just went out and found commercial clients for them. And then what happened was I became head of IP development at a game investor here in Scandinavia. And I realized that, this whole idea of building a lasting franchise, there was nobody was talking about that. No, there was no language in the industry for what makes an IP valuable and how does it connect emotionally and so on. Everybody was only talking gameplay and technology at that point. So that's why I got together with some guys and we started this consultancy, and we've been doing it for 6 or 7 years now. And we've done about 50 projects from, 3-man startups all the way up to working with Bandai Namco and Supermassive and PlayOn. And I'm currently mentoring 132 companies across Germany, startups on IP building. So we've just built an enormous amount of experience. How do you take a game and build it into something that has the potential to become a lasting franchise?
And that is a very important question. It's one that, like, from my point of view, with a lot of developers that I've interviewed, that oftentimes a lot in like the smaller side of things, it doesn't really come up all that much. Most developers will obviously be focusing on whatever the game is that they're working on, and then when that's done, they'll move on to the next. And unfortunately, some cases the studio may not be around, as unfortunately we've seen a lot of layoffs and closures between 24 and where we're at in 25. So. Yeah. I guess the first question that I want to ask you then, because I think this is something the audience is probably thinking. When you say kind of help a studio with building an IP, what does that mean, and how is that different from just making a video game?
Well, what we see across the board is that game developers, making a game is complicated. Right? It takes 3 to 4 years. It's technically complicated. It's artistically complicated. It's a big job, no matter what size your company is. So what tends to happen is that game developers just want to make a hit. We just want to make this game a hit, and then our worries are over. The problem is that once you get a hit, you tend to realize that hits disappear again. And that what you actually needed was a lasting entertainment property. So you can make game 2 and game 3 and the DLCs, and you can build, a loyal fan following. But the problem is that you need a few more things before a game becomes what is essentially an entertainment property. Because suddenly you're talking about what is the emotional experience that people want to come back and have again and again. Who is the tentpole character? Is it ownable in a court of law? Can you protect it so that nobody else can do the same thing? And the same with the world, and so on and so on. So the problem is you can't really own gameplay, right? Anybody can go out and make that same gameplay again. And you can't really own a visual style. That's not protectable in a court of law. So what you can own, for example, is the tentpole character, like the Hitman, like Lara Croft, like Batman, and so on. And by owning him or her, you own the loyalty to the emotion in your IP, right? Suddenly, I want to go back and have that experience again. There's the girl I had it with, right? I'm buying the next Lara Croft game, right? So that's really the thing. And building a game, you may have a startup with 3, but if you have any sort of success, you're going to be 10, 20, 50, 200 people. And they all need payroll, right? So having a sustainable economic, a sustainable way of bringing in money and predicting how much money will come in just becomes really important really quickly if you're building a studio.
Mm-hmm. So,
and of course, if your game fails, none of this is ever going to be a problem. But if it's a success, then you've got a problem, right? If you don't have an IP, you're starting from scratch again. What if the second game doesn't hit?
So I guess from that point, a question that I want to ask you then, when we look at kind of the successes of a lot of indie developers over the past 5 to 7 years, stuff like Supergiant Games, New Blood Interactive, Kit Fox, these studios typically focus on a very diverse portfolio. That it's rare for them to kind of just make a sequel to a game. In this respect, the IP that we're kind of focusing on seems to be more on the studio side rather than on the game side. In that respect, I guess how does your work or what you do, does that affect it at all? Does it change kind of your strategy?
So the funny thing is, when you mentioned those studios, I couldn't even think of what games they make. And all I do every day is work with game studios. So if you think, I had to look up Supergiant just now. Oh yeah, it's Hades, right? I'm not sure people buy a Supergiant game. I think it's very true. There are super experts like you and like me and our best friends. We follow the game press, we talk about games, we know the next game that Supergiant is working on.
Mm-hmm.
But superfans, some say, is 2% of the market, right? We tend to get stuck in this bubble because we're the experts and we hang out in the same places and go to the same conferences and so on.
Mm-hmm.
The rest of the public, what they know is Hades. I think if you ask 10 Hades players who made it, they wouldn't be able to tell you. So it's true it can be done. You can be a studio that just makes one hit after another, but it's super, super risky.
Mm-hmm.
Right? You are leaping off a cliff literally every time you do it. And I do think we're seeing increasingly, we just saw Silksong come out, Hollow Knight 2, definitely an indie franchise, right? Hades 2 is coming. Don't Starve is on its 3rd game or something like that, even though Clive Studios usually makes one-offs. So I understand the dream of wanting to make something unique every time, and I do realize that there is a handful of studios who can do it. but I don't think it's a sustainable strategy. You're really trusting that jumping off a cliff, there will be something on the other side every time. Yeah, it's not really a strategy. It's kind of trusting to luck and circumstance, and that's not really a strategy.
Mm.
But when that's said, we all got into games because we wanted to create something. We're artists at heart, or engineer artists at heart. I understand the impulse. I'm just not sure I would recommend it.
So, with kind of like what you and Leverage focuses on, obviously you can talk about NDA breaking clients and such, but I guess like what does like a typical day like look for you, like a typical like contract or work that you do?
So we're pretty privileged. We get to dive into new game universes pretty much every week. So what we actually often do is we do what we call an IP sprint, which is basically that we go in and in a few meetings we map out what are the goals of this company and this project. But then we start looking at, all right, so IP and franchise wise, what are the challenges? What are the opportunities? And what needs to be fixed if you want to build a sustainable IP? And I know the next thing you'll ask me is, so what are you looking for? Right? And what we're looking for is there something to own, first and foremost, right? If you're making a game about triangles, there's no way you can own that in a court of law. It's not protectable. There's too many triangles out there, right? And it's the same with a generic World War II soldier, and it's the same with an orc. I'm sorry, I see a lot of Tolkien knockoffs, right? There's just too many orcs out there. Even if your hero is an orc, you can't protect him in a court of law unless he's a really, really unique orc, right? So the trick is here that the only thing that's really ownable is the visual design. So if you think of Harry Potter or Lara Croft or Hitman, or whatever, they have this really consistent visual design, right? The Hitman has the suit, the red tie, the bald, he's got the pin code, he's got the 2 silver guns. This is ownable in a court of law. If somebody else does that, your publisher's lawyers or your lawyers can stop them. And that's where it becomes valuable, right? It's that when you can protect and prevent other people from doing the same thing, you're the only one who can do this. You own this loyalty that you're building. And that's where it departs a little bit from the artistic, hey, we're just doing we're just making the world a better place. If you want to have that be economically sustainable, you need to think in terms of, can it be owned? So that's the first pillar of what we're looking for. The second pillar we're looking for is an emotional connection. So the thing about franchises, even if you're only making games, right? Game 1, game 2, game 3. The thing about franchises is it's really about familiarity. It's really about, I know what I'm getting if I buy this. I trust that experience, and I want to have that feeling again. So if we start off by saying, well, this character or whatever the asset is ownable, we have something ownable, the next question is, what is the emotional experience we're going to associate with it? So every time we go back to, let's say, Spider-Man, we're getting the same emotional journey again, right? It's always Peter Parker. It's always he's bitten by a spider. He can do these crazy things. And then there's his Auntie May, and there's his employer at the newspaper, and then there's the latest girlfriend, right? And then he's a teenager. So every time we go to a Spider-Man movie or play a Spider-Man game, we're getting that teenage emotional journey and the wall climbing and so on mixed in, and then the latest supervillain. It's the same with Lara Croft. She's still looking for a file in the ruins. Hitman is still trying to figure out who he is while he's arguing with his employer. At the same time, he's strangling people or shooting them or whatever. But we're getting the same emotional journey again and again and again, and we love it. I love it. It's the same with Lord of the Rings and so on. So if there isn't an emotional journey in the game, then there really isn't the basis for building a franchise, or at least it's a weak one. And what I think what tricks people a lot is that back in the day, gameplay was enough. Right? When we were talking, Commodore 64 and early Nintendo consoles and PlayStations and so on, gameplay was so novel that you didn't need to have this emotional stuff. You didn't even need to have a character. We got away with triangles and tanks for 50 years because it was just so cool to shoot stuff. But today, there's just, 500 games dropping on Steam every week? And most of it is actually a variation of other gameplay. You need to stand out with the emotional stuff. And if you're going to get people to want to come back and remember it, that emotion had better be memorable and it better be unique. And that's the third big thing we're looking for is, does this stand out in the market? Are you making, another 2D Souls-like? Which, they're really flooding the market right now. And I love that gameplay. Bloodborne is my favorite game ever. But if you're going to make a Souls-like today, it better be different than all the other Souls-likes, because otherwise, why should I buy it? So it has to be ownable, it has to have an emotional connection, and it has to stand out in the market. Of course, that's a little more complicated than that. It can't be stand out so much that it's weird, because then you're going to get a very small audience. So it has to be kind of familiar, but it also has to be fresh, right? So there's some stuff there to balance.
To what you were saying a few minutes ago about kind of like the bubble when it comes to understanding these games, that I think has always been like one of the challenging aspects for a lot of developers. I think especially for when we see someone in the AAA or AA space go to the indie space for the first time. I've lost count the number of times I've seen a game on Steam that says, we're former developers of EA, or we worked on Dead Space, Gears of War, pick any AAA franchise, and they try to make a game that's similar to it, and it just goes over like a lead balloon. There's no interest in it. There's oftentimes no marketing that goes with it, and it is like very much that situation of you can't just make what you've already done before. If you're trying to give me the indie version of Gears of War, and it plays almost entirely like Gears of War but worse, why should I spend money on that? Why should I even look at this game? And earlier you mentioned, of course, Silksong. Like, Silksong coming out as it did, just like what they announced like 4 weeks ago, the time I was recording this, maybe a little bit more than that. They had like clout to it. They have, I'm sure, like if you were to grade their IP at this point, like Team Chair is a really solid IP when it comes to Hollow Knight and the branding that goes with it.
Right. Absolutely. I mean, that knight is a super ownable character, right? Nothing else really looks like that. And if it does, it looks too much like them, they can go after them in court. That's a really clear tentpole character. I haven't played it a lot. I haven't analyzed it, so I don't know what the emotional journey is. But from what I've seen, it's very emotional, right? It's got this melancholy feel and super stylized and so on. It feels like a really unique experience. So my guess is that the emotional journey is there, and it really stands out, and it's ownable in the court of law. So with those three pillars that we talked about, that it really does it. I think you have a really good point. We with the AAA developers who go indie, I mean, we often see this problem. One of the problems is that if you're a AAA developer, then you often are super professional at organization, technology, gameplay design, all these things, and you really can do that at a high level. And you know who to reach out to fix the things you're not good at, right? So you can really produce high quality. You know how to do it, you know how to budget it, all that. But what a AAA developer rarely does is originate. So they're really not used to making something new. And I'm not saying all of them, but I'm saying we've seen a lot of teams where that's the problem, right? Everything else is just top notch. But they've never created a character from scratch before. They don't understand what and how do we build something original, make it emotional, all that. because what they're usually used to having is having the Star Wars manual slapped down on their desk and saying, build this, right? And that means all the origination has already been done. And that's where the indies have a leg up, right? They're used to starting from scratch. They enjoy that whole process. They then have the opposite problem, which is that they often fail to think commercially until it's pretty much too late, and then all they can do is hope.
And with kind of like making something that's marketable in that respect, you mentioned Bloodborne and the whole Souls-like genre. Like, for me, and I think for people watching or listening to us record right now, they know I have played a lot of Souls-likes over the past 10 years. And it is a very hard genre to design a game in, let alone make one that really sticks out. And I think that is another really good question for you with leverage and kind of working with developers. You've brought up, again, very marketable IPs like Lara Croft, Hitman Agent 47, I believe he is, and many others. When it comes to working with a developer, like you mentioned the orc example. Like, let's say I come to you and I have this, let's go with like an anime, like super happy, very bombastic, cartoony orc character. And I say, okay, I'm building this game. What can you help me with? Like, what do you see as good, bad? Like, what do you go from there?
Right. So, I mean, of course, it depends on what stage you're at. So if we're, pre-financing, you're still building your pitch and so on, then we're very much looking at, can we help you to expand your pitch so you're not just pitching a gameplay loop, you're also pitching a potential franchise. And that's where your happy orc comes in, right? Is this a character that, even at pitch level, we can see this is going to be attractive, this is going to be fun, and it's going to stand out? And if it isn't, okay, let's talk about what we can do. What will usually happen is that we will make some suggestions, and then the team will go home and work on it. And then they will come back and say, okay, here's what we'd like to do. And then we'll have a discussion about it, because it has to be true to the team's artistic direction, right? It can't be us telling them, here's your solution, you should do it, because they're going to have to make it live. They're going to have to bring it to life and make it sing and dance and make it actually funny. So it really has to be true to what they find exciting and what they want to make, but we can challenge them. We can say, that's nice, but you're going to have to keep going. That you need to take it to the next level. I've seen 20 orcs like that, right? Keep the orc, keep the fact that he's happy, keep the fact that he tells jokes, but keep pushing. You need something more. You need something more. It's kind of like a layer cake, right? A game or a movie is a lot of layers, and often it's about, right, the foundations are there, but you need to take the emotional journey, because I've seen that before in this and this, and you need to take a tempo character and maybe a couple of other things and add something to it to make it unique, to make it stand out, to make it memorable, to make me connect with it emotionally. And a thing that really comes up a lot is relatability. And it's a weird word. What it means is I recognize my real life emotions in what's happening in the game, right? Is it sad? Is it happy? All these things. Do I recognize that? And what we get a lot is, 5 orcs in a boat, or 5 strangers in a spaceship. And that's not super relatable. Not a lot of people have been on a spaceship with 5 strangers, and it doesn't feel, I don't feel an instant connection to that situation. So what the big franchises do, and what we strongly recommend, is they make it relatable. How do we bring it really close into something that a lot of people can recognize from their own lives? Mm-hmm. And often the answer is family. So if you think about Game of Thrones, Spider-Man, Lara Croft, Horizon Zero Dawn, all these things, it's all about family, right? It's all about their relationships to their mothers or their fathers or their sisters or their brothers. And that is instantly relatable. So, even, the Thor movies, which are way out in space and have, meter long horns on their helmets and giant spaceships and so on.
Mhm.
Basically, two brothers who don't like each other, right? That's a super relatable situation. And I think games we've been a little bit slow to pick up on that, because it was so much fun just to interact. It was so much fun just to shoot tanks. We've only recently, I think, in the last 10 years or so, gotten to making games relatable. You see The Last of Us, you see The Witcher, you see God of War. They're super relatable. Hades. Hades is all about family and uncles and aunts and so on. And I think the reason is that, where the movies, they had to put actors in front of the camera from day one. So it was instantly about humans, and they pretty quickly, well, I don't know how long it took, but they latched onto the idea of the familiarity. We're getting there now, and if you think about it, that's when game movies started to get good, right? That was about when this relatability started coming in. So that will often be a thing, right? So I'm going to be asking you, who is this orc? Who is his family? And why aren't they on the boat? I mean, and a question we often get is, well, wait a minute, that means father-son stories have been done, but they haven't. There's an infinite variety. And what I usually say, don't worry, your father-son relationship is fucked up in a completely unique way. So I would suggest you base it on that.
As to kind of like follow up a question for you, then, one of the things that we've also seen, at least like with some of the more like niche genres, is that they're oftentimes not tied to a specific character. So this is when we talk about like strategy games. If you look at stuff like XCOM, for instance, like probably the only relatable character we talk about like modern day XCOM would be like the announcer or the your like gravely voice assistant or whoever's like talking to you.
Yeah.
When we look at genres that they're not kind of character focused, so we don't have a mascot, we don't have like a front person to kind of put this branding on. I guess, how do you focus on an IP in that respect?
So, I mean, there's a couple of things to unpack there. And one is that you don't have to do IP.
Mm-hmm.
It's not an essential thing. It's a strategy you choose. And it's also a second business model, right? So the first business model is, how many games do we sell? The second business model is, how much value are we building in the IP? So you don't have to choose the second business model. You can say, we're just going to stick with, owning a gameplay genre, for example. And what you often see is that, the people who come first and pretty much own a genre, a gameplay genre, they don't need an IP. So you think of Counter-Strike or, games like that. There's really not a dramatic IP there. There's no tentpole character and so on. It's got a pretty strong emotional journey, but it's really just a game brand. So if you own a category, who cares about the IP? You're big enough already. But if you want the IP, then the problem with not having a character is, when you later try to do it, you're really at the mercy of the movie industry, right? So Fallout got lucky, I would say. They got some really good people to airlift characters into a universe where there really weren't any characters. Or there were very few, at least. It was mainly a world. So they got lucky. And that can go badly wrong. The thing is that when you talk about, for example, strategy games that don't have a character, that's enough for some people and some companies. But if you want to appeal beyond the people who love this particular game mechanic, then you need to start thinking in terms of, what's the emotional appeal? Can I get people in who aren't necessarily fans of the genre, but who think this story of revenge is exciting, and I'll play this game to get to that? But that's a different thing, and it's a different strategy. So, to be honest, you don't have to have an IP. Absolutely not. But there benefits to doing it.
Mm-hmm. And bringing up Fallout, I think, brings up another interesting point. When you look, you mentioned Bloodborne earlier, and From Software has had a very interesting run in this respect. That almost every one of their games up until this point is not really character driven. If you look at Bloodborne, you're just some guy. If you are playing Elden Ring, you're some other guy.
Yeah.
In these respects, but as I'm sure you're about to point out, the world building in these games is probably, a major part of these IPs. You can have 20, 30 different fantasy settings. That's not the same as going through Yharnam in Bloodborne, or going through the world of Elden Ring, or going to Khalid, and so on.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think when we work, we operate with 6 or 7 pillars to make a cohesive IP, and the more of them you have, the stronger your IP experience or IP universe is going to be. And the world is definitely one of them. Absolutely. And the world is also about the mood and so on. In Yharnam, in Bloodborne, that's extremely strong. The interesting thing about From Software is they're one of those companies who invented a category, right? So they basically, of course, invented the Souls-like. And that means that, the Dark Souls games have enormous loyalty because I want to do that again, and they're the best in the world at it. If you're coming in second and making a Souls-like, you really need to stand out on the emotional experience because the gameplay has already been done. How else are you going to differentiate? But then it's interesting to think about Bloodborne, because I think that's the most IP-like game that From Software has made. It's even stronger than Elden Ring. It'll be interesting to see what happens with Elden Ring, but we'll see. But Bloodborne is an interesting case also because Bloodborne has a temporal character, even though your character doesn't look like that. And we get that question a lot from game developers. Wait a minute, I'm making a game where you can choose your own character. How can I make a temporal character? And my answer is always do what Bloodborne does. Make a really cool character who represents the emotional experience you're going to get in the game, and put him on all the key art. Put him on the covers. Put him on the menu. Put him on the advertisements. You can make the Bloodborne movie tomorrow. He's going to look like that. I've never had a character that looked like that, and I've played a lot of hours of Bloodborne. So you can do that. I think this is related to another question we get, which is, wait a minute, I'm not making a linear game. How can I make a clear emotional journey if my game is a sandbox? And my answer is, well, your gameplay loop is an emotional journey, right? If somebody tells you what it was like to play this game, they are telling a story. That is an emotional journey. And because of the punishments and rewards and progressions that you built into the gameplay, there is a clear emotional journey there. And from the world building, it has a tone. So, we do have a repeatable emotional journey.
Yeah.
And people also tend to, you were talking about the world building. People really tend to underestimate how much the world building is storytelling, right? I mean, how did this world get to look like this? That's the story, right? The story in Bloodborne is, what is the Blood Scourge? How did it break out? Where did it come from? Why are the hunters here? What happened to this guy with the music box and so on? So you're uncovering the past. And that is very much storytelling, even though you don't necessarily have a linear story being told in the game. So yeah, the world building is a huge part of building an IP, and Fallout is a great example, right?
Yep, and with From Software, they are probably some of the best when it comes to kind of the lore of their worlds because of that. You look at something I think Armored Core 6 is very underrated in that respect. It is a game where there is literally no characters. There's no portraits. You never see another face in that entire game. And it's all sold through the voice acting and the writing. And it's just amazing in that respect.
Yeah, I must admit I haven't played it, but I should have. I'm a big fanboy of From so far.
Hmm. And something that you said a minute ago that I want to go back to, I think it's very important. That you said that From Software, being the developer that coined the whole Souls-like, they became kind of like the brand of Souls-likes because of that. This is something that I see from a lot of developers, especially in the indie space, where a game blows up for whatever reason. Five Nights at Freddy's when it comes to mascot horror. Slay the Spire with deck building. A Balatro that came out last year in terms of kind of a gambling side. And when these games kind of blow up, we always see developers rush to that genre. Vampire Survivors. I can't count anymore how many Vampire Survivor likes I've played in the last 4 years. And a common issue that I see with a lot of these games is that they try to just make the same exact game. This is my version of Vampire Survivors. This is my exact version of Slay the Spire. And to what you've been talking about, there's just no kind of connective tissue. It's just, here's another deck builder. All the cards look almost exactly alike. Same, GUI and a main screen. You could put this next to Slay the Spire and be confused, which game is which. Right. And when we talk about design-wise, as you said, I think I'm also part of this, like, gameplay-wise, if the game works, I could care less about the aesthetic. If you want to copy Slay the Spire 100%, but you do something different with your gameplay, I'm here for it. But again, that's not the same as a general consumer. If you're trying to sell this to someone who's not a super hardcore deck builder or a super hardcore Souls-like fan, and your game just looks like it's ripping off Elden Ring or it's ripping off Balatro, people are going to just turn away, even if the gameplay is good. And it's that challenge again, as what we've been talking about. What is kind of the reason to play your game? What makes this game different from everybody else? And as you're talking about kind of the emotion the game is excuse me, trying to convey, that I think is another very underrated aspect when it comes to talking about design in this respect. Because again, when we talk about gameplay, we can talk about platforming, we can talk about shooting, sword swinging, navigating in spaceships. But what makes your ship different from someone else? What makes your cards different from somebody else? And if you don't have an answer for that, something that I say a lot is the consumer's not going to answer that question for you. They're not going to solve your marketing problem.
No. I think the challenge here is also it's the strong connection between what's inside your IP universe, what's the emotional experience, and connecting that with the brand and the positioning in the market. And positioning is an interesting term because it really means, in the mind of the consumer, how are you positioned? And if you are positioned in a space where there's no one else, then you're standing out, right? But if you're trying to move into a space where somebody else is already there and they're big and popular, you're going to get crushed. If you want to make a modern Hitman game, I'm not sure I would recommend that because that space has been taken. And a time-traveling Hitman has also been taken. I would not recommend trying to take that position in the market. So what positioning means is that you need to find a space in the market that has not been taken. So if your passion is to make a deck builder, all right, that space has been taken. There's a couple of really strong games out there who do deck building really well. What is it about your deck builder that moves it into a position in the mind of the consumer that has not been taken? And since what you're mentioning is you're probably only incrementally improving the core gameplay of deck building, right? It's not like you're reinventing deck building. You're incrementally improving it. And that doesn't move you to a new position. That moves you a little bit. You're still overlapped by the big guys. But what if you then, on top of that, put an emotional journey that has not been seen before, right? So if you make it a descent into madness, or you make it, a different emotional journey that has nothing to do with what the other deck builders are like, then you're satisfying all the deck builder guys and girls, but you're also making it different, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you might even get lucky and start bringing in consumers who've never played deck builders before, but who relate to that emotional journey that you are now making your game about.
Yeah. And for anyone watching or listening to us right now, you're probably immediately going to guess what game example I'm going to mention, as you were just describing a deck builder but going with a different emotion. And that, of course, is Inscription, that came out a few years ago. That Inscription is a deck builder. You draw cards, you build a deck. But the whole kind of like meta aspect and the whole horror, the idea that you're not just playing against a monster, you have some strange, individual in the back who's staring at you the entire time. It drew heads, it drew eyes and attention to that game, and I think it became Daniel Mullins, the creators, best-selling game. I think it either won Game of the Year or got nominated as well. And again, as the cycle continues, we've seen other developers who are now trying to copy that specific style when it comes to their version of a deck builder, or even just their version of a game. And I guess this is a question I want to ask you, because it's something that I've thought a lot about. There's been people love to try and theory craft why game A succeeds versus game B. And when it comes to some of the indie games that we've seen, sometimes it feels like it's almost random why one game is the one that everyone can't stop talking about. As we're talking right now, I'm finishing up the work on my latest book about cozy and wholesome games, and I mentioned Power Wash Simulator. Power Wash Simulator is a game that you just power wash stuff. There's no character hook. There's no very gripping story. It's just you cleaning up your house. And yet it resonated with a ton of people, and they're making a sequel. I can, give me a few minutes, I can probably think of a few other games that just, even if they're in the same genre as someone else, it's just this specific one that seemed to hit the lottery. And I know for any developer listening to this conversation, they're thinking, why can't my game, get that lucky? So what I want to ask you, as someone who studies the business, the IP, and the marketing side in this respect, is it just luck, or is there something else going on that you can put your finger on?
Oh, it's complicated, right? I mean, if you are an indie developer and you're coming out of nowhere with a new game, I mean, half of it is how good are you at building a following for this, right? Are you building wish lists and so on? So, part of it is just sheer entrepreneurial grit. That's one thing. Another thing is, I mean, when you mention Power Wash, this is an example of inventing a new gameplay genre. Right? I don't remember anything else doing that before Power Wash, but after it, we're seeing a lot. So, there is that. If you've invented a new gameplay mechanic, then you have a chance of winning on novelty. Whoa, there's this new thing I haven't seen before. On the other hand, if you look at Schedule 1, that blew up because of one streamer, right?
Yep.
So there is luck to it, right? But on the other hand, it is a good game, and it is fun, and it is controversial, and all those things that made it streamer friendly. So, have you built something that lends itself well to going viral? That's worth thinking about. And there's a lot of things there. So I think if we're talking about our way of looking at it, are you building an IP? Are you building a brand? Then I think for an indie team, that's more about, are we building in the potential for this to have a long life? because I don't think necessarily the IP is what's going to get you that instant success. I think that is a combination of many factors, including that the gameplay has to be brilliant, and does it lend itself to streaming, and do you have the entrepreneurial grit, and 5 to 10 other things. But if you do hit and it doesn't have the potential to be a lasting IP, then it's going to be a very brief hit.
Mm-hmm.
And that's tough if you're trying to build a studio, right? If you want to make a career in games and you've struck gold, if you've struck, let's call it striking oil, right? Wildcatting is going out and just drilling and hoping there's oil. When you strike oil in the games business, that means you've made something that resonates with people, like Power Wash. Now, once you've struck oil, the question is then, can you keep it? Can you sustain it? Yep. Can you make game 2? Can you make game 3? Or is it open to anybody to come and copy? And that's where the IP comes in, right? Mm-hmm. If you've made a game about triangles, it's not protectable. It's not ownable. You're never going to see a TV series about triangles, right? So, yeah, the answer is it's complicated, and the IP is what will sustain your studio. It's not necessarily what will make it a hit.
Mm-hmm. And that's a really good point about when you're trying to make something else, when you're trying to build off of a good or even just an average game, how do you go from there? Because oftentimes what we see is either the next game is just exactly like the first game, or you go in a very different direction. One example is, as you were talking about like games going viral, and something that I mentioned a few minutes ago is, of course, Five Nights at Freddy's. That if we're talking about kind of like an IP coming out of nowhere, it's probably the king of it in the 2010s. I've mentioned this story before. I've seen, like, when I was at a doctor's office, like, kids were drawing, like, different Five Nights at Freddy's characters. There are books on FNAF. There's the whole movie that just came out. Like, in terms of an IP, it is probably one of the most, aware that ever came out of the indie space. And we've seen developers try and chase that with their own mascot horror. I mean, if you talk to anyone who covers horror games, they will probably bemoan how many of them try to copy the FNAF formula over the past 15 years. Or, I'm sorry, it's about maybe like 12 to 13 years at this point. And it's that kind of like chase of virality that it almost feels like if you try to force it, people are going to immediately call you out on it. And you can't really, like, it's very hard to, I guess, like, plan around that unless, again, you get really lucky.
Yeah, but what Five Nights at Freddy's did was it made a really original game first, and it was a really original universe as well, right, with the teddies and all that. So it really had the positioning thing down. It took a space in the market that wasn't there before, and it owned it. And if you're copying that, you're going up against the king. They are the king of that space in the market, and you're attacking their castle. It's going to be either expensive or painful, or both. I mean, we see a lot of games that look too much like Overwatch. Don't do it. It's already taken. You need to make something new somehow.
Yeah.
So that's for sure. Another thing that complicates it, I mean, once you're talking about the transmedia spread of Five Nights at Freddy, is of course Hollywood, right? What is it that gets the attention of the right person in Hollywood and enables them to get it financed, and suddenly it's happening? That's a black box, right? It's not like you can reduce that to a formula.
Yep.
Hollywood is, I've had a bit of interaction with it. It's a very different place than the game development industry. So what gets made there and doesn't get made, that's a whole other story. So yeah, nobody said it was going to be easy, right?
Yeah. And I wanted to get your thoughts on this next example, because we've been talking about games being the first, the one that kind of breaks the mold, and then they kind of get that crown. But there is one example, of course, of the second, or even I think this is like the third or fourth game that became the king, and that would be, of course, Fortnite with Battle Royale. By the time Fortnite came along, there were already, I think, like 4 or 5 other notable Battle Royales. H1Z1, King of the Hill, PUBG, I think I'm forgetting another one. And I kind of know the answer in my head, but I want to get your thoughts on this. What do you think Epic did so well, or did they do well, to kind of get around the fact that they weren't the number one developer to make Battle Royale, but they somehow got to that point where now, whenever we think about Battle Royale, we automatically think about Fortnite.
Right. Well, I don't actually know, but I can guess. As far as I remember, what they really did was they went free to play. And this was at a time when free to play was only emerging as a business model. Before that, pretty much everything was premium. And suddenly it was free to play this great game, and it was a good game. And it spread like wildfire. And at the same time, I think the word entrepreneurial grit applies here, right? They put Epic's muscle behind making this thing big. And it's not all just about making something great. It's also about, do you have the muscle or the grit to get it out there and get a lot of people to see it and convert them to users? And then there's all the complications of, how do you retain them in there, and how do you hook them up with their friends? So this is where your friends are. And suddenly, it was the place where your friends were. So of course you would go there. So I think it was a combination of course, it was a great game. Of course, Epic had the entrepreneurial muscle to push it out there. And then this free-to-play move was, in hindsight, absolutely brilliant. Is that what you were thinking?
Yeah, I was saying the free-to-play angle. I was also thinking about kind of, as you were saying, like the Epic muscle, or in my mind, kind of the polish that went into Fortnite. And I think we could even take this as far back as like World of Warcraft and how it originally succeeded. That World of Warcraft was not the first MMO on the market, but it was the first one to really kind of polish that design to a sheen that got people interested in it. And I think there's always that, it's, again, as we said, it's a very high risk, high reward strategy. If people already are playing an MMO or a Battle Royale, do you try to, as you're saying, do you try to take a shot at the king? Because you can, take out the king, and if you do that, you're the new number one. But
you better really do it well, right? It's like David Bowie once said, it's not about doing it first, it's about doing it second, doing it right.
Yeah.
I don't think that's a great indie strategy, but if you're Epic or Blizzard, you can do that. And then, of course, Blizzard already had the Warcraft IP, right? Yeah. So there was already a certain loyalty and trust there. They'd made 3 Warcraft games already, and then they went World of Warcraft. But that's actually another thing, which is that changing gameplay genres or mechanics inside an IP is a super high risk thing to do. Yep. It worked for them, but often the expectation will be, I'm buying the same thing again, right? I'm not sure we're going to be seeing a lot more Gears Tactics games or Halo Wars games, right? I mean, why do we buy that IP? We buy it because of the gameplay we expect to get. And we want it fresh, we want to see something new in it, but flipping it to a completely different mechanic is, wait a minute, that's not what I bought.
Yeah,
but there is a third thing that plays in, which is the greatest show on earth. If you can supply the greatest show on earth, that can be enough, because that will build the hype, right? And this is what James Cameron has been doing for many, many movies, right? Terminator 2 was the greatest show on earth. Titanic was the greatest show on earth. Avatar was the greatest show on earth. Right? You just had to see it. And I think, to a certain extent, World of Warcraft was the greatest show on earth when it came out.
Yep. To the point about when you mix genres and IPs, that I think is another very interesting topic. you mentioned Halo Wars and Gear Tactics. There's that. I think there's always that kind of idea that if people love my first-person shooter, surely they'll love my real-time strategy in this world, or my city builder, or my platformer. But as you
Yeah.
said, like part of like when it comes to the IP side is that the gameplay is still a facet of it. If I'm going to play, for instance, Donkey Kong, the new Donkey Kong game that just came out for the Switch 2, I'm expecting to do 3D platforming. If I pick up a new Mario game, the same thing. If you're telling me the next the next main Mario game is now a, I don't know, slow stealth Metal Gear Solid like, I'm
Right.
gonna be sitting there going, what? Like, why would I, like, it does not interest me. And sometimes I think it can deliver some very interesting surprises, like Mario Rabbids, the tactical strategy game from Ubisoft. Like, I love that game. Like, no one thought something like that would come out. But
Right.
more often than not, we see that situation where if you kind of try and cross the streams, in a matter of speaking, you sometimes just end up with a game that there's no appealing factor to like the people who were going to originally play it.
Yeah. And again, I think familiarity is a huge thing in
Mm-hmm.
IPs, right? You're buying, you're making a safe purchase. I know what I'm getting because I
Mm-hmm.
know this, I trust it. And if it's suddenly something else, wait a minute. And when you start working with IP, an IP universe and gameplay at the same time, now you're suddenly talking about two sets of expectations, right?
Mm-hmm.
So one set of expectation is my expectation of the gameplay mechanic. Another expectation is my expectation of the story genre. So, if I'm expecting over here, it's I don't know, an RTS, and over here I'm expecting it to be a gangster story,
Mm-hmm.
then it better do the things that RTSs do, but it also better do the things that gangster stories do. And that means you can't suddenly introduce robots halfway through, right? Because gangster stories don't have robots. So unless you've built the expectation around that mix, it's breaking the expectation. That's what's kind of dangerous.
Mm-hmm.
And that doesn't mean you can't mix genres. I mean, stories today mix a lot of genres. Ever since Star Wars, we've been mixing genres. Star Wars is a fantasy, it's science fiction, it's Western, it's a war movie, but it does all those things well. And you expect that mix. But if you've already created an expectation that it's only a gangster story, then you can't suddenly in part two introduce robots. Right now, you're screwing with my expectations.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the same goes for the gameplay. And I imagine that's why they brought the rabbits in, right? It's because we're resetting the expectations here.
Mm-hmm.
If it had been, I don't think we haven't seen Mario in that kind of turn-based tactics gameplay before. That would
Yep.
have felt weird. But the rabbits can do it because we don't have those expectations tied to them.
Mm. Yeah.
So that's the tricky thing about IPs, right? And that's also, I think, why many very artistically oriented indies resist the idea of building an IP because they don't want to be trapped in the expectations. And I don't blame them.
Yeah.
But you just have to make a decision as a company. Are we building a company or are we a group of artists who work together?
Mm-hmm.
And of course, that's a sliding scale, right? It's a sliding scale between being pure artists and being completely commercial. You have to decide where you are on that sliding scale. The
Yep.
problem is usually that when I ask a team, so where are you on this sliding scale? Everybody says we're right in the middle. But when you ask into that, what they actually mean is we want to be complete artists, but we want to be really successful. That's what they mean, and that's only one in a million, right?
Yep.
The problem is you start referencing somebody like Playdead who made Inside and Limbo, who make one unique game every 7 years, and because each game has been an evergreen, they're doing fine. Great, we want a career like that. That's kind of like saying we want to do what the Beatles did, right? Yeah, that's a nice ambition, but you probably won't. Maybe you should think a little more safely while combining that with your artistic ambitions.
Mm-hmm.
I think what people need to realize is that artists need patrons and entertainers need customers. And you have to choose. And if you can't find a patron who will give you free money and expect nothing back, it's really difficult to survive as an artist.
Oh yes, I can certainly attest to that one. And
yeah,
it's that challenge. It's like something that I say to a lot of developers that the second you are making a game that has a sales tag to it, you are making a product. There has to be, again, as we've said, something that the consumer can latch onto. And I have played so many games from my first time in smaller developers where it's a unique game, it's something no one has ever seen before, but it is so kind of like a mishmash of ideas that it will only appeal to, some crazy person like me who will play like the strangest games that are out there. And yes, there is an audience for that. Like, some of these games can attract a cult following of fans. But again, it goes back to that ever important question: how do you fund your next game and the game after that? And it's a question that no one really likes to have an answer to, or no one really wants to answer.
Yeah, and it's a really difficult question, right? And it's what you have to remember is, if you're the kind of game you just described is what I would call an art house game, right? And there's definitely an art house audience out there, but it's less than 2% of the entire market. And if you're Lucas Pope, you can make a totally art house game and you can max out that 2%, right? You pretty much every art house audience member has bought that game, and maybe a few who weren't. But how many art house games do that well? It's the law of silent witnesses. It basically, if somebody survives a shipwreck and they come out and they tell you, hey, I survived because I prayed to God, you have to ask how many of the people who died also prayed to God, right? You never hear about the 999 art house games that didn't find success. You hear about Lucas Pope, who found it. So yeah, the art house, it's a great ideal. I would myself have loved to be an artist, but I just realized that it's just too difficult to survive. And total power to the people who can.
Yep.
There's a lot of us out here who would love that career, but there's not many of those careers around.
Yep. And I guess like a final point about that is that when we have like those art house successes, like everyone will try and jump on that. And as you said, very few of them will make it. And another point I like to say is that there's a difference between the fandom for a game and a fandom for that particular genre. Because people thought, like going back to World of Warcraft, that, at its peak, they were pulling, I think, like 12 to 15 million subscribers a month. And everyone thought, well, that means there's 10 to 15 million potential customers for this game. During their peak, obviously, not a single game ever managed to get close to what World of Warcraft was pulling in. And it's the same thing with stuff like Vampire Survivors, with Balatro. Pick any kind of like a flagpole style game like that.
Yeah, and I mean, for me as an IP guy, something like Balatro, I think it's brilliant. I had to get rid of it because it was taking over my life. I think my son was sitting in high school watching Balatro spread from screen to screen in a single room, right? It was that kind of game. But as an IP guy, for me, it's just a huge wasted opportunity. All those eyeballs, and you didn't build any ownable IP. All those millions of eyeball hours spent just looking at numbers and little flames. If there had been a character there, that would have been a massive property by now. I'm not saying he should have done it, but I'm saying it is a missed opportunity if you look at it from my angle.
All right. But as a time check, we are about a little over an hour. I know you have to get going in a few minutes. So to start to wrap things up for our conversation, I guess the first kind of wrap-up question for you is, anything else regarding what you do at Leverage, making an IP, building a franchise that we haven't touched on, like for people listening to us, that you would like to mention?
Well, I think based on the experience I've had across both really small companies and really big companies, it can be pretty important to bring in somebody from the outside to appraise what you're doing. Because whether the team is small or big, when they've spent time with their idea, they're so close to it, they can no longer see the trees for the leaves, right? There's so many moving parts in making a game, so many cogs and so on, so many egos in play, and decisions were made for not necessarily the best reasons, but sometimes they are. Having somebody come in fresh and say, look, guys, the important bit is this thing over here that you forgot about 3 months ago, that can just be enormously important. And it doesn't have to be hugely expensive. It's just important not to get too insular. So I think that's my recommendation. It's bringing somebody who has a different perspective and get their appraisal. And preferably get somebody who knows what they're doing. That helps.
All right.
Yeah.
Oh.
But this is a great show you've got here. I really enjoyed that. It's been a lot of fun.
It's always great to have these conversations. We can go for hours if we're not careful, but we're both dealing with very different time zones, so I think we'll wrap things up. But if you're free in the future, Christian, and you'd like to come back on, we can always continue this conversation.
I'd enjoy that. I really enjoyed it. I mean, it's very inspiring to challenge each other and look at things from different angles. So I'm definitely up for that.
All right. So, from your side, anything you want to mention in terms of social media, stuff people can find you or your company, stuff like that?
You can find us at leveragepartnership.com. I'm also on LinkedIn. We've worked with a lot of indie games, so yeah, we'd love to hear from you.
All right. And I'll include a link to the website down in the notes. So, with that said, we're going to wrap things up for this conversation. As I said at the beginning, if you are a developer wanting to come on and chat about your game, you'd like me to do any kind of consulting work, stuff like that, please get in touch. Be sure to buy all the many copies of my books. There's even more coming, as I'm sure, in the future by the time you're watching this. And with that, be sure to come back for daily discussions on game design here and on Game Wisdom, where you some of the art and science of games. Again, Christian, thank you so much for coming on, and best of luck with any more or continued work that you're doing with Leverage.
Thanks a lot. Best of luck to you. I look forward to reading the book.
All right, so with that said, everyone, thanks for tuning in, and we will see everyone next time for another great conversation.